Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and I am here with my utterly cromulent co-author and co-host,
Trent Hergenrader. Hello.
Today we're going to discuss Chapter 1, Around the World in 300 Pages, which grounds the broader world-building conversation in a few different topics. Trent, would you be so kind as to give everyone a preview of what we'll be talking about?
Yeah, so in Chapter 1, we cover quite a bit of territory, just trying to sort of outline why we even bothered writing this book. So the topics that we'll go over, we'll be talking a little bit about the history of education, how and why we would think about complex systems that rule the world today, how we think about complexity of generalizations and stereotypes when we're thinking about the world and talking about people, getting into critical thinking and empathy, and then finishing off with what is this world building? What can you possibly do with it? And then sort of like an overview of where we try to go with all of these topics. So again, this is going to be a lot of broad kinds of questions, and then also trying to get into the things that we weren't able to fully expand upon in the pages of the book.
Yeah, I know we talked a little bit about going through the subheaders. So if you're following along with the book or you recently read it, you should recognize some of the content. We're going to try and keep everything contained, our conversations contained to the relevant chapters, but certainly we're going to jump around. So if you haven't finished it yet, you will get a preview of some of the other ideas that'll come down the pike. I know we initially, when we started working on this book, we're trying to think of a metaphor that would be useful for getting the audience to understand why complex systems matter or how they are embedded in their lives. And when I first drafted Chapter 1, I know this was something that I kicked to you first, and you kicked back to me, and we played around a lot with how we wanted to open this. I wanted to utilize an example that came from the educational technology course I used to teach with Michael Young at the University of Connecticut, which was this conversation we'd present to the pre-service teachers in the teacher education program about why education and educational technology mattered. We opened that conversation with this comparison between medical facilities and classrooms from 100 years ago to the present. We started doing this when I was in graduate school. Actually, I think Michael was doing this years before. I don't know where he got that initial example from, but the reason why we did this was because we wanted to contrast as strongly as possible the role of technology in a classroom versus other domains. And a lot of the pre-service educators we worked with, and this is true across universities, don't spend a lot of time thinking about why technology matters or how it interfaces with education. Most of the time when you're going through a teacher education program, you're thinking about your domain content, so English or science, mathematics, whatever. You're also focusing on behavior management and not so much on theory or on the integration of technology as part of the classroom experience for the instructor and the learner. Now, what made medicine and education pretty useful comparison points is that medicine has gone through a dramatic series of changes over 100 years. Education has gone through comparably fewer. A lot of that is driven by technological advancement in the realm of medicine versus the follow through of technology developers for education. We talked a little bit about this when we discussed in the prologue edutainment and chocolate covered broccoli, but in the realm of education, it's very easy to have technology become an afterthought simply because of the fact that there's not a strong impetus to incorporate it if you're most focused on getting students to regurgitate content. We'll get more into this regarding Chapter 3 and the integration of instructional design models with learning theories to be able to produce more or less effective, quote unquote, content and pedagogy. But for the purposes of introducing somebody to why world building was necessary, we thought going back to that specific exemplar of education as technologically behind other domains as being a useful vehicle or fulcrum to think about it. So I don't know if you have any particular thoughts about world building as a technology, Trent, but it seems like that was something you and I agreed on being a useful vehicle or fulcrum.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I'm thinking about my background in creative writing and specifically creative writing studies, which is this sort of critical interrogation of what it is that we're trying to do with creative writing. And when I was in graduate school, I was on this Facebook group that was creative writing pedagogy and making this case that, there's collaboration, there's digital, there's whatever. And this is like in the early, 2010, somewhere in this range, late 2000s. And I remember there was somebody who's actually a fairly, I won't say his name, but he was a fairly well-known writer who got his MFA and he's written some very well-received books over the years, and he's heading towards retirement. He's probably retired by now. But I remember him saying that the good things in creative writing will never change, right? Like it's just that's the way it is. We should just keep doing it, keep looking at style and craft and all these other ways, right? And I said, okay, well, even if that were the case, now we've got students who are engaging with digital tools. They are already collaborating. They are playing games. They are taking in media from all these different sources. So even if you would suppose that that were the best immutable way of teaching, well, our students have dramatically changed. And then to
Hmm.
say, too, that the whole creative writing industry was completely disrupted by Web 2.0 technologies that allowed people to publish their own work, and all these kind of things. So it just struck me as really sort of this backwards way of thinking that it's like
Hmm.
we know what works, so we're just going to keep doing it. And it's like, okay, but it's not bad to think, okay, our students are in different places than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And a lot of it has to do with the media that they're consuming, the forms of media that they're consuming, and the technology that they're using, right? So it seemed to me of course, I didn't get into too much of an argument, but just said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do the things that I'm going to do because this seems to make zero sense to me that you would just keep teaching people the same way you did in 1980 because the world
Hmm.
has changed a lot since 1980. That's not even going back 100 years. That's just going back, 20 or 30 at that point.
Yeah, it's very visible when you go into a medical facility and think about this too. I know it's not as visible in education because a lot of the technology that we utilize isn't shiny in the same way that it is elsewhere. So, for instance, yes, you can bring a robot into a classroom, and we'll talk about Seymour Papert and the logo turtle and everything else down the road, but it's not quite the same as seeing the way that robots are transformational for doing remote surgery or for being able to conduct laparoscopic surgery or something that viscerally feels different. Whereas
Right.
in education, the technology often is applied as an add-on to what you were already doing. It is not fundamentally changing the structure of the thing you did. So Mike Young and I actually wrote a chapter about this in Exploding the Castle, which is entirely focused on why technologies ultimately epically fail in classroom environments. And maybe we should do an entire separate conversation about that and how world building fits into that ecosystem. But the big takeaway from that book chapter was essentially that education is just not a great fertile soil for planting a lot of these things because the institution of
Yeah.
education is itself so difficult to change. And there are other incentive structures in medicine, I think, that make it more prone to being changed. Just the fact that you want a higher survivability rate, you want to demonstrate that you've discovered these new technologies or these new medical practices that are ultimately going to make people's lives better. That's true of education too, except that the time scale on which those changes are felt is so much more immediate in medicine than it is in education,
Yeah.
where if you change the way that you're instructing your students, you're often not going to be able to see the product of that change until years down the road when they're making decisions as business leaders or as professionals, as lawmakers, et cetera. So the time scale, the lack of immediate gratification or instant gratification in education is another one of those reasons it's easier to push the technology to the side. It just is not felt in the same way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think this is, to go back to what you were saying about creative writing and digital media, there are places where I think introduction of technology is immediately felt in the realm of writing. Journalism feels like it's a place like that.
Hmm.
The even in the publication of creative media, it's felt quite a bit because of the fact that the way we make movies changed very quickly, the way that we distributed that information changed very quickly. In the world of music, the same thing has happened. Napster fundamentally changed the way that music was collected and distributed, and the digital revolution has just had that more obvious impact in these other spaces and not in education. And my question has always been why? And I
Yeah.
think, I'm just spinning my wheels here, coming up with ideas for why that might be the case. But
Right.
the reality is these fundamental changes to the structures or institutions associated with each of these domains has been really important for the evolution of those domains. And yet, education remains in this space that looks almost identical to what it looked like 100 years ago, just with a couple of sequined jackets and things attached to it to make
Hmm.
it look a little bit flashier. So I think it was really important we started with this example because it allowed us to segue into saying, and here's why world building is different and
Yeah.
why it would fundamentally change the structure underneath all of that.
Right.
So I guess that's a good segue from this conversation about education versus medicine and the role of technology to the broader question of why is it good to understand the world this way?
Hmm.
Why do we think that a multilateral approach to the practice of education is actually a good thing for teachers and students, and why it's something worth adopting if you're considering something like world building for your classroom.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, even to take a step back too, and to think a little bit about the different kinds of educational domains that we're talking about, and some of them are sort of fixed and stable, and others are not. You know, like obviously journalism, fiction writing, poetry, all these kind of things
Mhm.
are going to change dramatically based on the technology, whereas something like, you know, the basic laws of physics or something like that
Mhm.
do not change. But on the other hand, I think one of the things that thinking about the world building and the things that we talk about throughout the book is that the classroom and the dynamic between teacher and student has definitely changed as well. So I believe that so much of our educational system, especially going back 100 years ago, was built from sort of an assumption that maybe if you're reading Shakespeare or, you know, studying history or something like that, there were sort of capital T truths that the students in the room would just need to accept. Like these are, you know, once you memorize these, once you understand these or master these, then you go about your business. But it was assumed to be white, it was assumed to be male, it was assumed to be straight, it was assumed to be
Mhm.
sort of middle class or affluent. And I don't think that was ever the case, right? But it was just everyone is supposed to pretend that that was the case. And then you start thinking about classrooms today and you bring in issues of race, class, gender, religion, other questions, sexuality, you know, all these kinds of questions. And you start thinking about, okay, well, wait a minute. Like, even if the content is more or less stable, how do the individual people in the room maybe receive that information, or how may they be able to see opportunities, you know, differently, or obstacles differently than the person who is maybe teaching in the room, you know, or all these kinds of
Mhm.
questions. And I think too, in terms of Web 2.0 and what we're seeing, like, you know, the areas that I'm really interested in, Kickstarters for tabletop role playing games and things like that, these communities who I think had been historically silenced or marginalized, kept out of the conversation, if you want to make a black queer role playing game and you can get the money to do that through crowdfunding, then it's made, right? Like then it
Mhm.
happens. Whereas the old layers of gatekeeping would have prevented that from happening. There's not a big enough audience for this. There's not enough people who are interested in this. This is a niche concern. So those are going to be through market pressures or just even the assumption that there's not a lot of interest out there. I think what we're finding today is that there's tons of pockets of interest in all of these kinds of things. And then starting to think about, wait a minute, even if we take something like a high school or a college classroom and really start thinking about going through person by person, there's a lot of diversity, no matter what you know, no matter where you're at. I mean, it may be different types of diversity, but to really think that you're going to have, you know, in a classroom 20, 30, 35 students who are all looking at the world in identically the same way or be receiving the information in the same way seems, you know, downright naive at this point.
Mhm.
And to not be able to account for that and not to be able to make that central to the education is, what is everybody doing with this thing that we're learning right now? It seems to me to be, you know, where we need to be going, and again, how that world building sort of aspect fits in to the question that you just asked. And I'll throw it back at you. You know, for these questions of the importance of understanding global networks, like we're talking about in the book, just one is a simple cup of coffee, and we start thinking about, okay, there's, you know, you go in to a coffee shop, you grab your coffee, and you walk out, and you're not thinking about whatever you just paid $5 or $6, where all that money is going, who's it all going back to. And like we emphasize in the book, it's really about all the people who are the humans who are involved in making the world in a way that allows you and I to be able to buy a cup of coffee that maybe originated in Brazil and the paper came, you know, from another part of the world or whatever. But just sort of being able to understand, not to take all of this stuff for granted. Nothing just falls from the sky. These are all parts of human systems, and there are humans all throughout this system, and we ought to be thinking a little bit about people who are throughout the entire system, and then thinking about questions, at least from my end, social justice, wealth distribution, those kinds of things are the people who are on the bean picking side of the equation, as well compensated as the people who are on the sort of advertising and corporate side of the equation. And really, you know, you don't have to, you can say, okay, this seems fair, this sounds good to me, or you can get you really sort of radically motivated to change the world. But in order to have either one of those positions, you really need to understand how it works first. So I guess I'll throw that back to you. When we were writing through that section, and it's something that you'd said there was a lesson that you'd started with many times in the past. What is it about that example, or even just, you know, any example, to get people, again, sort of like first, we were doing sort of like a first day of class. Maybe this chapter one is like a first day of class for the book. What is it that you're trying to get your students to think about? Like, how are you framing, or how are you using these examples to frame these questions of people who are going to be educators?
I really like the fact that this circles neatly back to the question of what has changed over 100 years between the hospital setting versus the classroom setting. That we are essentially doing the world building process and thinking about the way that these spaces are constructed. And so, as you're describing the intersection in getting a cup of coffee, right? All the different systems that have to come together. I'm thinking about the sociopolitical and socioeconomic and cultural, all the various aspects that influence how medicine comes together or how
Hmm.
education as a whole comes together. And specifically, the fact that education as we experience it now is based on an industrial model that was built for efficiency, not for making sure that everybody came out of the classroom a well-rounded, self-regulated individual. And
Right,
so
right.
there is this economic element to it that isn't expressly felt in other domains quite the same way. So when I go to these examples, when I'm trying to get students to understand something about the world, the reason I choose these ones in particular is because I think they have enough contact with those systems to
Hmm.
be able to do that interrogation for 10 to 15 minutes and think through how do all of these different pieces fit together. So when I present them with the coffee cup and ask them, where does the paper come from? Where does the ink for the logo come from? Where does the water come from? How is that water cleaned? Who's responsible for making sure that it gets cleaned and that it's not filled with who knows what? Who's making sure that the store that you're buying this coffee from is capable of providing you a cup of coffee that isn't going to make you sick? All of those
Hmm.
different elements are things that the learners have visibility into and then can work backward and extrapolate. Okay, well, maybe I wasn't giving this as much attention as it deserved, or maybe I hadn't considered the person who was picking the beans, or I hadn't considered the fact that as an educator, that the classroom I'm teaching in is the byproduct of a system that was founded over 100 years ago, and that all of those various complex systems and social forces are still influencing it in the present from the past.
Hmm.
So I think I talked about this a little bit when we recorded the prologue episode, but for myself, only really started to understand how these systems interacted when I got to college. And it wasn't the fault of any of my teachers. It's just the fact that we silo all of the
Yeah.
disciplines so that they aren't interconnected explicitly. There were some of my teachers and some of the project we did that were sort of cross course when I was in middle school that helped exaggerate some of the ways that school is siloed and that we don't actually talk about things in the way they happen. Specifically, we did an entire unit on the Civil War that was cross course, where every single class we did was about the Civil War and math, and the Civil War and language arts, and the Civil War and history, and the Civil War and science. And those grade levels, I think it was 6 through 8, where sixth grade we did the Middle Ages, seventh grade we did the Civil War and Ellis Island and immigration, and then eighth grade we did mythology, and then we followed up with sort of the Industrial Revolution. But it wasn't until I was in college that all of those pieces really came together. And since I was teaching college students, I wanted to make very clear to them that they needed to start thinking about the world in these terms, as
Hmm.
opposed to thinking about it as being a separate world of language arts and from a separate world of science, from a separate world of math, from a
Yeah.
separate world of English. And these examples just happened to be a good way to get them to talk about those things. One of the benefits and drawbacks of being in education is that everybody has contact with it and has an opinion about it, and
Yeah.
sometimes those opinions are not well formulated
Hmm.
based on your experience as a student versus your experience as an educator.
Right.
But at least it's a thing that we all have in common that we can work from. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I also used to use this example of a movie theater where all of us go into the movie theater to watch whatever the new movie is with our own experiential baggage from outside the movie theater. We're often not thinking about the same things when we get there, but the goal of the movie is to create this shared context that all of us in the audience are going to be able to draw from. And when we leave, have something to think differently about when we go into the world. All of my students were coming into the classroom with this experiential baggage that they'd accumulated over time. And these examples were meant to be a way to bring commonality to their experience, or at least generalize some of the things we're going to be talking about and thinking about in a way that it would affect all of them once they went back out into the world and that they could communicate about to other people. So it was supposed to be sort of a focusing mechanism or a
Yeah.
focusing lens, if that makes
Well,
sense.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the things too that, as you were talking, reminds me. I mean, because being in the College of Liberal Arts and dealing with the humanities for the most of the time, one of the things I get really frustrated with today is this idea that okay, you're coming to school to get your degree, you're coming to university to get your degree in electrical engineering, and then maybe you're going to minor in economics because that's going to be a really smart way to sort of like manage your life and your career. It's like okay, but from my end, that's great from a career perspective. You're still going to be a citizen somewhere. You're still going
Hmm.
to be a partner. You're still going to be somebody's child and somebody's friend and possibly somebody's parent, right? And these are the things too that we're trying, at least, historically, in universities, trying to attend to that. Like if you are thinking about, there's a referendum about building a new wing of the school for performing arts, and you got to vote. Are your tax dollars going to go up to support that, or are they going to, not be used for that or something like that? That has nothing to do with you being an electrical engineer with your degree in economics, right? That
Hmm.
has to do with you as a member of a community. And I'm feeling like, as you were talking too, one of the things that really drives me crazy right now with what we're seeing in the politics in the United States is this inability to sort of think about, well, is this policy or does this thing exist for people not like me? Right? Like everybody feels like it has
Yeah.
to be for them. And this is one of the things too that when I go through, like I always spend my last class period doing sort of like a post-mortem for the semester that came. And a lot of the time, what we're talking about is someone says, you should do this, you should do that. And I'm like, okay, well, if it's a 15-week class and I'm going to be adding something, what would you take out? Right. And then that's where it's like,
Hmm.
okay, that's a lot harder to answer. And then there are other times when I said, okay, well, like, especially this has happened so many times with the world building. In the world building class, generally, there's sort of the meta narrative or the broad story of the world. Then there is the building of the catalog, people, places, and things. And then there is the writing of the stories based on people who live in that world. Three separate parts. And I've got usually 20 students. And it almost always breaks out that there are a handful who love the meta narrative, there are a handful who love the cataloging,
Hmm.
and then the ones who love the storytelling, right? And I said, see, I can't just do all meta narrative. You would love that, but the other two groups would hate it. So when you're building a class, you're not trying to make it perfect for every single person. You're trying to figure out, how can I create an experience that is going to do the best on this topic, meet these learning outcomes for as many of the students in this room as possible? Not even knowing how many of them are going to take the opportunity, seize the opportunity to do the work and do all these other things. But it's impossible to build the perfect class that works ideally for everybody because people have different interests. So the best thing that you can do, and I
Hmm.
think it's the same thing with governing a society, there's certain things that, yes, certain people are going to benefit more or less from various decisions that we make as a group, and ideally democratically, we're electing officials who are going to sort of turn the gears to make sure that those things happen. But we always need to be keeping in mind what is happening to those groups who aren't getting what they wanted. My own particular political bent is I'm not so broken up if somebody can't afford their sixth house in Vail, Colorado. Like that's a sacrifice I'm willing for them to make, right? In order for public schooling and things like that. But it really feels like in this moment that it is, instead of us living in one shared world in which we're trying to figure all of these things out, in way too many people's minds, it becomes this tunnel vision. This is what
Hmm.
I need, this is what I want, and this is what needs to happen in order for that to become real. And it's like, okay, but that is a very selfish way of working in the world. And whether you incorporate other people's views or opinions or what needs to happen or not, those people still exist. And those conditions still exist. And I think that this is where that kind of highly individualistic, on the borderline of being antisocial, leads to lots of societal discord. When you've got too many people who are denying other people, the things that they want or that they feel that they need, and you're not having open communication about it. To go back to something that's maybe less dire, like a performing arts center. If you're really into the performing arts, well, sure, you would love that. And if you don't think that that's that important, well, maybe you don't care about it all that much. Well, is that going to be the make or break for anybody, right? But it's different when you start thinking about, are people going to be able to have housing? Are they going to be able to have clothing? Are they able to have shelter, right? And I feel like we're moving into a space in which people will just say, well, I don't care about those people. Like, I don't care. And it's like, okay, but what is somebody who has no housing, food, or clothing? How do they then respond to their conditions, right? It's like what options do they have available? And they tend to be pretty antisocial options. So again, just thinking through, and of course you can't provide everything for everybody all the time. There are limited resources, but there's got to be some sort of balancing act where you're saying, okay, are the most people going to benefit the most from these decisions? And you may not be the person who's benefiting in that position, right? In that situation.
Right.
But just being able to do that math, well, maybe if it doesn't work for you this time, then next time around, then something will come your way. But even just sort of understanding that it is just doubling down on what you want and doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on what you want is not a good way of living, because there's got to be other reasons, other valid, legitimate reasons that other people would want other things, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. There are valid, legitimate reasons why other people would want something other than that. And the goal of a critical thinker is to be able to think through and then again come away with some sort of answer that at least accommodates for the positions that you yourself don't hold.
I keep thinking as you were talking about the conversations we've had regarding the tone of this book and whether or not we thought it was going to end up on some banned book list because of the fact that certain people don't like critical thinking and the ways that it forces other people or gives other people the opportunity more accurately to have a different opinion about a thing. And that is the unifying principle behind a lot of this. I know when we had said previously that this was meant to be a very flexible system and it's interdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary, the real reason we say that is because it is constructed around making good decisions by being able to empathize with other people and use logic or reason to be able to reach that conclusion that's going to lead to whatever the best outcome is for the most number of people. And you can make an argument that this is very utilitarian or that it's aimed specifically at supporting democracy as a mechanism for how people manage themselves politically and socially. But the thing I keep coming back to is you're right. This is very much anti-individual because the entire purpose of engaging in this kind of exercise, this world building exercise or collaborating with other people to model a world, is that you want to understand the world from other people's perspectives, which is inherently a pro-social action as opposed to an anti-social one. So I've wondered before, and you and I have also joked about libertarians will really hate us for this book, right? Like, because the entire thing is aimed at making sure people understand that other people matter. So Ayn Rand would be really pissed off at this.
Yeah.
I know enough about Ayn Rand's perspective to be able to say this is not your cup of tea if you really believe that everybody as an individual needs to be pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and that somehow society will function with everybody being on an island. And, not to mix a bunch of metaphors, it's just that we really earnestly think that we create a better civilization when more people can think about these things. And we're
Yeah.
not trying to prescribe to anyone some partisan political viewpoint. And I think that's a really important thing to reemphasize. I know we mention it repeatedly through the book. The goal of world building is not to impose on somebody else any particular belief. You could do this for any different subject from any different perspective. The goal is just to make sure that everyone is equipped with the tools to be able to understand the world from other people's perspectives and that there is some shared framework for good faith negotiation
Yeah.
over those things you're talking about. Like with respect to how do we finance the performing arts center, there doesn't have to be one correct way to build
Yeah.
that
Exactly.
institution. There can be multiple good ideas or multiple ideas that are amenable to one another that can come together and coalesce into something that isn't strictly zero sum. And I think
Right.
that's kind of
Right.
what you're talking about with this notion that everybody's an individual and if you're getting something that's good for you, then that means I'm losing something that's good for me. But that's never actually the case, at least
Right.
not here.
Right.
And yes, resources are finite, but that doesn't mean that the distribution of those resources has to be conducted in such a way that only one person wins or that we
Right.
can't have multiple
One
constituencies
demographic. Yeah.
serviced. Right. So that's one of the reasons why, to go back to why is it important to understand global systems? It's because we want people to come away understanding that number one, you are not the only main character here. We are all the
Right.
main character in
Right.
our own story, but that doesn't invalidate anybody else's story that they're telling or them being the main character. And frankly, the world can't function if we don't have the ability to talk across purposes and make sense of other people's perspectives. Like
Yep.
you end up in a place very dark very quickly when you're constructing the world only around one person's perspective. And I think that's to the extent that we were able to communicate that to our students, that was aimed at making them better citizens, making them better
Right.
thinkers, making them, as you mentioned it during the prologue recording, go into life with better questions than they came in with,
Right.
right? And
Yep.
I don't know. I don't know if you want to riff on that a
No,
little
I
bit,
think I
but
mean I think one of the things too that I also hear quite a bit being an academic and being a professor, this whole idea that professors are fomenting, the revolutions of tomorrow, and all those kind of jokes, because we've got these liberal professors that are brainwashing our students or whatever. And the funny part is, though, the rebuttal of that is always, have you ever been to a faculty meeting, right? Like no two people can agree on anything, and it's really because intellectuals and academics are always trying to think about all of the different people who may be affected by something. And it's really, really hard to be able to okay, these people are going to get the shaft, but we need to make this difficult decision. And as you were talking, I was
Mhm.
thinking specifically about higher ed is in flames right now, hence my background. Higher ed is sort of in flames. It's way too expensive. We're trying to figure it out. And I've got colleagues that want to be able, on principle, 6 students signed up for their class, and they think that class should run because it's a matter of academic freedom and all of those kind of things. things, right? And what I'm thinking, and will argue and get into arguments with some of my colleagues, is okay, I understand if six students want to take it and they're excited about it, and that's the class that you want to teach, that's all fine and good, and there ought to be space for that. But you have to understand too that the university has a limited number of rooms and a limited number of seats, and they can only schedule so many classes at so many times. So it's understandable that they want as many full classes as possible, right? So the negotiation would be how could we maybe attend to some of the topics in that class in a different way that you could maybe get more than six people, right? It seems to me that that is a negotiation. And the number of people who are just on the far theoretical end, well, no, it ought to be this way. And it's like, okay, but yeah, in a perfect world, but we live far from a perfect world. The administrators don't care about our little niche discipline. They're looking at why is a room three-quarters empty when it should be two-thirds or three-quarters full in order to get as many students through as possible, right? And even just each individual university and its management as an individual world and what the different stakeholders are thinking about throughout the entire system, right? I don't think anybody's super pleased, but it's basically everyone has to figure out how do we get these tuition-paying students through with an education that we can all sort of sleep at night saying they got what they paid for. Because I do think that, if they just handed everything over to faculty, that probably I shouldn't say we would probably bankrupt the institution within a matter of months because we would want to do the high-minded, perfect thing. But that's not a real solution, right? And I think that that's where having those questions of like, okay, well, what do we sacrifice or where do we, the idea that a compromise is both sides feeling unhappy with the end result. And I think that's where, too, just thinking about those kinds of questions. And if people are too unable to think through or even be able to say have a hierarchy of what they're willing to give up versus what is a no go, then you just get steamrolled by power in those cases, right? Then you stop having power if you are so unable to give up anything. But then again, also making sure that you're taking care of and not budging on the things that really, really matter. And for me, those always tend to be the human sided sort of aspects of it. So
Actually, well, the way you're talking about that makes me think that the benefit of doing this kind of activity in a classroom is really that you're orienting students toward or having them simulate the spectra that actually exist in reality. And it gives them the space and freedom to do that safely so that they can fail at some of those tasks of putting together all those big pieces or asking those big questions with you there to be able to intervene and teach them something about how do you think about hard problems. And
yeah,
we'll get much more into this when we talk about simulations and black swan events and wicked problems. But the real utility, I think, is just getting these students to leave the classroom knowing that the world's a lot more complicated than perhaps they were led to believe.
right.
And you made the point in one of the chapters as we were working on it that often these students are coming to the classroom not because they are bringing these high-minded philosophies they developed themselves. They're coming in with whatever they were pre-programmed with based on the families they grew up in or
Right.
the location where they were born and the various elements of the environment that informed their perspective, not because they were exposed to all the different ideas and they picked the ones that made the most sense. And what we really want them to be able to do is start that process for themselves. So to the
Right.
extent that higher education is indoctrinating students, it's indoctrinating them to be able to make those decisions for
Decisions, yeah,
themselves, right?
exactly.
Like, and I think that's if you're coming from the perspective that you've been privileged your whole life, your ideas have been privileged your whole life, and then suddenly somebody says, well, actually, there are a lot of different ways to think about a thing. Of course, that's going to seem like oppression, right? Like,
Yeah.
so to the extent that higher education is indoctrinating students, it's only because of the fact that those students were finally told, actually, you can kind of put together the pieces in whatever way you want. And I know that that realization for me was jarring when I was younger, that I realized that most adults are just going through the motions and that
Yeah.
they don't actually know the answers. And that was simultaneously horrifying because it raised these questions like, how does anything actually get done? And how does the world actually work if everybody's just kind of
Winging it.
fumbling through it? But at the same time, it was super liberating because it made me
Right.
realize, oh, actually, I do have agency in what I think and feel about the world, and that I can act in ways that I think comport with my own sense of reality and capital T truth. And
Yep.
so there is this weird, as much as we said that this isn't necessarily a treatise on explaining the individuality of everybody and how we should all be working toward our own selfish ends, it does actually give you the tools to think through where do I as an individual match up with and grade against other people. And
Yep.
It's not to say that there is a better or worse way to be. I think, from my perspective, being more pro-social is probably better. But really, the whole thing is about those spectra and how everybody exists between two poles, that there isn't just this black and white answer to every problem where either somebody's winning and somebody's losing, or it has to be this way or it has to be the other way. Really, what we're trying to argue is that there is a middle ground, and that often we're going to have to stake out that middle ground on our own, and that
Yep.
we're going to have to figure out some system to be able to put together those pieces in a way that is cognizable and actionable and practical.
Yep.
And I think often we're stuck in this situation, as you said, with faculty where we all want the utopia, but there is no pathway to get there. So we have to figure out what is the best approximation to get to the thing we actually want to achieve.
Yeah. And I
And
think I was just
yeah.
going to say too, like switching gears, because I think a lot of this too is, the sense that there is a right way or even a few right ways of doing it or whatever. And it's like in practice, it's really hard. And I think that this is where, too, the idea we talked before we got on about sort of like some of the third rail kind of questions that we're trying to address in this book. And I think, at least for me, this idea that you can be wrong, it's okay to be wrong, just adjust based on what, if you're corrected or if you run into somebody and they, have a completely different worldview, well, you can sort of, change your mind, bring that into your world model, and then sort of move on with life through that. But even that is super maybe oversimplified. So I wanted to throw to you this question, right? So we talked about in the book through various chapters this idea that in order for us to function, to get out of bed and get our pants on, we need to make some generalizations about how the world works, how everything
Mhm.
is sort of connected. And then within that, there's always going to be the specific people who cut against the grain. But if I say something like, okay, all the French are rude, and Dutch people are really arrogant, right? Like those are gross generalizations. But then what do you do when you're in a classroom, right? And you're working with either K through 12 or in the university and you're working with young people and someone makes a statement like, I don't ever want to go to France because they're all rude, right? I said I'm doing a study abroad to Spain again, and I had a student who shuddered and said, the Spanish hate tourists. They throw water on them, right? Because apparently there was a demonstration in Barcelona which is now having a problem with over tourism, where, locals were throwing water on the people or whatever. So what do you think? This question of when does a generalization become something that is useful, that we can be like, okay, everybody in Wisconsin loves the Packers, and when does it become sort of like a harmful stereotype, in which it becomes, I don't even want to list all of the ways that we think about that we may be able to compartmentalize and say, well, this person is an X, so therefore it must mean all of these other kind of things. So the question then is, how do we work between these generalizations and these stereotypes and the fact that if we really try and create a world in which absolutely everybody's every desire is, that's just not possible to do that? Who gets to say when a generalization is okay, or it's okay to maybe have those people not get what they want?
I struggle with this a lot, and I know in the book we say a few times that this should border on the obvious. If you're going to make some generalization, it should border on the obvious, that there is some well-defined thing that you can point to and say, hey, this lends credibility to this specific idea or perspective or way of understanding some group or thing. On the other hand, we also talk about how privilege determines who's making those calls, and their decision making is not unbiased. So we kind of have to struggle with this question of, okay, where is this thing harmful or not harmful? Is it actually being applied to everybody in a specific group? Is it something that all people within that group actually do, or that there's some evidence to support the fact? And I think our characterization of this is probably the best we can get, which is, okay, so you don't want to go all the way into pigeonholing people into some specific position. You also don't want to end up in complete cultural relativism where nothing matters because everybody's making it up as they go along. There's got to be somewhere in between there. And like so much of what we say in the book, it's situated. I mean, you're basically going to have to make that judgment based on the specific context that you're talking about and based on the evidence that exists or doesn't exist. And this is why we recommended using qualifying words like many or a few or some people, or trying to find ways to leave space for somebody to defy those expectations without coming down to some reductive explanation of what that thing must be.
Hmm.
And I actually like the example we give later on. I think it's in the chapter about life worlds. And we talk about how people generalize and utilize those stereotypes to cause harm explicitly. We end up going into essentialism and like what defines an essentialism? What does it mean to act like an essentialist versus somebody who is more thoughtful and nuanced about how they talk about other people? And the main difference ends up being that the former, the essentialist, is always going to be arguing from the perspective of a lawyer who starts at a conclusion and
And
then
then works
tries to
backwards.
justify their conclusion based on evidence instead of like a scientist, which is more like the latter. Scientists are gathering information and then suggesting a path forward. That is largely, I think, how we tried to talk about generalization and stereotyping is that you want to behave more like the scientist. You want to take the information that's available to you, draw some conclusions based on that information, but always leave room to say, here were the limiting factors or limiting elements of my characterization of this group. That there are certain things that I can't understand about them because I wasn't there, or that I'm not part of that culture, or I'm not part of that group. But also, here are some things that are definitive based on quantifiable evidence that we can say is true of some percentage of those people.
Yeah.
And obviously, there are some categories for which there is a very small number of people in that group, and there are some categories where there's a very large number of people in that group. But there is no way that we can definitively say that everybody in a specific group is always X or is always Y. There's always got to be that wiggle room just because of the fact that we don't always have universal
Yeah.
visibility into a particular
Per
group of people.
perfect information. Yeah. And I think that this is, one of the things too, coming from, I'm a white middle class guy, straight guy or whatever. And it's like, also being from this place where if someone is going to, it may be easier for me to say than it is for me to sort of enact. But I think it also works on the other end that if somebody says, oh, to use the most sort of benign conversation kind of piece or whatever, oh, you're from Wisconsin, you must be a Packer fan, to not get all defensive and riled up if they're wrong about that, right? And just be like, oh, well, no,
Hmm.
as a matter of fact, I could care less about football or whatever. And I really think this is where the idea of, two people, two human beings in any given moment being able to exchange communication, right? You don't have to like each other or whatever, but there should just be that basic level of understanding that if I make a mistake or if I make an assumption that isn't trying to categorize you in a negative, harmful way, then you can also just kind of take it with a grain of salt, correct it, and then move on with your life, right? Without it having be the worst affront where you cannot get along, right? Because there are a lot of times where I always think somebody had said this. I remember reading something in graduate school where I think Rosanna Arquette had received some award and she'd said something about feminism, and this woman wrote this huge thing on how she got it wrong, and whatever. And I remember one of the first comments was, she didn't get her PhD in women's studies. So I think we got to cut her a little slack here, right? And I think that this is where, too, the more there is this impulse to be right, I think especially amongst people who are on sort of the left or the liberal side, once you know that you're right or you think that you're right, just really being able to drive that home in every conversation, like that's an example of this and that's an example of that, even if you are right, about those things, like if you're saying you're going to challenge a sexist comment or you're going to challenge a racist comment, which for the record, I think we ought to be doing, we need to be doing, there are ways to be doing that to make it a learning moment as opposed to a moment that is going to get a negative, violent reaction that is actually not going to change anybody's mind, that is not going to open anybody's perspective. And again, these are things where thinking about the politics of this book and not being sort of entrenched in one camp or the other. We've talked about this before too. I grew up in Green Bay. It was a very sort of mixed between Democrats and Republicans at the time in the 80s or whatever. And I remember neighbors talking about things all the time, right? You know what I mean? Like just be in the
Hmm.
agree to disagree. And it feels like we've gotten a long way away from that. And I think, I'm sure we will talk about this in later classes or in later podcasts. But this idea of, the media and the way that we're bombarded with information all of the time, and we're really being schooled into forming really hard shells of who it is we are, identify as this person, and never change, right? And I think
Hmm.
that, I think this is something true that's true on both sides of the political spectrum, or all sides of the political spectrum, where I think what we all need to be doing is being way more open to being wrong, way more open to being sort of like, this information in this moment is what I understand, and I'm going to be making decisions based upon it. And that could change in an hour or a day or a year, just based on the life experiences that you have, and not demonizing. Because I know this is one of the things being from Wisconsin. As soon as Wisconsin had started flipping over to voting for Republicans in the later 2000s, people, oh, well, screw it. It's, Mississippi. It's, it's this conservative stronghold, and it's like it isn't. It's like a few thousand people switched from one voting block to the other, and then that, because of our political system, it's like, okay, but the whole state didn't just change its mind overnight. And living in the Eastern time zone, it was really dispiriting to see the number of people who otherwise I would politically and sort of, in a lot of variety of ways, agree with their worldview and things like that, suddenly fall victim to the same gross generalization that was really off-putting to me, right? I'm like, oh, you're flushing a lot of friends and family that I have down the tube, and I don't think they've radically changed. I think just the state flipped politically. So being able to figure out one of the things that we talk about all the time is just where we're at in this political moment and how do we get out of this political moment where we can't even talk across party lines.
Hmm.
And I think a big part of it is being less sure of yourself, especially about other people's intentions, other people's motives, sticking to what you believe, but then also sort of like expecting and demanding that from the other side. But I don't, again, I don't know how we get there. And it seems to be it seems with the nature of the way that social media and information is buffering us all the time, it seems like a very big uphill struggle to get us back to a place where two people can see the humanity in each other, and maybe not agree, but at least agree that the other person is a human being who deserves dignity and respect, right? And I think this is where,
Well, it's
yeah,
funny because, one of the other questions we were going to talk about is how do you measure critical thinking and empathy? And I think about this all the time because we're making this claim that the book can teach this stuff. And if you're able to teach it, you should be able to assess whether or not it's actually been taught and whether it's been internalized and replicated. One of the challenges is that people are just really complicated. And I feel this, even you and I talking about politics, even within our social circle, even people who agree have different reasons for believing the things that they do. So, of course, the further you get apart on some partisan scale, the more likely it is you're going to have disagreements about things. But we're stuck, I think, societally in this tug of war between no true Scotsman and both
hmm
sidesism,
yep,
right?
yep,
Either you believe everything I believe without any dissent whatsoever, or you equivocate on literally everything and therefore don't believe in anything. And maybe this is a function of the degree of nihilism that has sort of pervaded society as a result of technological developments in the realms of social media and now LLMs and AI, where
hmm
there is just an incentive structure, and that really this is about hypercapitalism. It's the incentive structure that drives clicks, which drives money, which drives, and we could talk about the relationships. This is another thing I used to show my students when we would talk about this specific subject in my various classes, either game systems or in the instructional media course. I would introduce to them Noam Chomsky and the idea of manufactured consent and
hmm
how all of these systems are interrelated, and we are not trying to other people through our discussion of those systems, but we have to have a way to be able to talk about it that generalizes across groups so that it's clear who's being affected and who's not being affected. And it doesn't mean that one group that you define in one specific moment has to be defined that way forever. It's
forever,
just
right,
a
right,
snapshot in time of where are these different groups at and how are they behaving and on what identity axis are they aligned.
yeah,
And that's another
exactly,
thing that we talk about, I think, in the Life World chapter. But there's a quote from a Hong Kong dissident, Bao Pu, that's referenced in Ben Rhodes' book. And one of the things he talks about in that book, or one of the reasons why he's interviewing Bao Pu, is specifically because of the relationship between China and Hong Kong and the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong relative to mainland China and the Chinese Communist Party. Bao Pu ends up saying the 20th century was all about ideology, but the 21st century is all about identity. And I think
hmm
that's what you're describing
yeah,
is the tension
absolutely,
between ideology and identity and the way that we understand each other as individuals versus as units within or nodes within a complex system. We tried to emphasize this when we talked about qualitative and quantitative descriptors, that you and I have some descriptors that we would say are definitely in common, but obviously the more axes you're cutting across with respect to identity, the more different people seem because they do operate on all these different axes in different ways. So the reason why we wanted to talk about generalization and stereotype to begin with is because we wanted our learners or the students we were teaching with these methods to be able to recognize that sometimes some people do fall into the same category and sometimes they don't. And those things are flexible. And, certain categories you can't go back and undo because they're sort of temporally locked. You can only be born into one place at one time,
right.
and you can only experience time linearly from the beginning of your life to the end of it. But that doesn't mean that you can't change your identities in a bunch of different directions while you are living through time and while you are moving through space. So really what we're asking the learners to do is understand identity as sort of a quantum thing that
Hmm.
there is until you go and actually measure the thing, it's always in flux, and you kind of have to go moment to moment to understand what somebody's identity is. And just because they believe one thing now in this moment doesn't mean they've always believed it. It doesn't mean
Right.
they will always believe it.
Right.
And so when it comes to acting in the world politically or as a citizen, or if you're trying to persuade somebody of something they don't already believe, then you have to understand that there's always going to be those incremental changes over time. And so having one online argument with somebody on social media isn't going to
Yeah.
be the thing that changes their perspective. It's going to be the result of many different things influencing them towards changing that perspective over time.
Yeah.
And world building and world modeling are a way to help emphasize the incrementalism of that process or that project for learners who are going into the world having been now at this point grown up in a world where everybody's yelling at each other online all the time.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Exactly.
yeah.
I think too, I mean, like it's one of those things growing up in Green Bay and looking back, I mean, the culture at that time, and I haven't been back there enough to speak of it, but it really felt to me in that time in the 1980s, it was something that I would describe as toxic masculinity, right? Like people were really into like traditional roles, men work on cars, kill deer, all this kind of stuff. And that was just not me. And I'm like, oh my God, what's wrong with me as a person or whatever? And then when I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is, a very leftist institution, I remember my first couple semesters there, 18-year-old kid from Green Bay, traveled, but whatever. When I'd start learning, I took a class in women and gender studies and just thinking like, wow, this is really, I don't agree with all of this stuff, but it planted seeds in my
Hmm.
head, right? And as time went on, and as I started thinking about the kinds of things that I was learning about gender inequality, historical, inequalities, things like that, it really started to make me see. I started putting the pieces together, right? Which again, I'm very biased in this regard. That's what I think going to university is supposed to make you do, right? But I just remember thinking that today, if I had been a 19-year-old or an 18-year-old in a freshman class and said something that was fairly dumb, right? Like women are just that way or whatever, right? If you get hammered and shamed in that moment that you were dumb enough to make that statement, then you are far more likely to not change your mind, but never speak in that way again,
Hmm.
unless you go online and find some odious chat room in which you're going to find all these trolls who are going to say, well, yeah, that's why men are being oppressed now. And
Hmm.
I had the very different experience because, again, I think it was because the media was not coming in from so many different angles, all the time with podcasts and, all that kind of stuff. Over time, I was able to sort of piece those things together, see patterns both in the material in other classes, in my social interactions, in my own history of, the life experiences that I've had, and then came around. And it did not take very long for me to become a feminist, right? Because it's like, oh, this in my mind, right? I'm going to put aside what my male experience has been and start to think through the empathy part, think through these different experiences from different perspectives. And then it became for me something that, oh, yes, this is quite obvious. This is the case, right? But
Hmm.
had somebody said in that moment, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire until you proclaim that women are equal, like I think I would have resented that, right? Like so many people today were like, I don't want to be told what to do, but you need to be able to give people the space to learn on their own and not shove it in their face. But when inequality, especially now, it seems so dire and so extreme, there is sort of an urgency for people to get it sooner than later, right? But again, it's one of those things where to me it's a balancing act. You can't push people. If you push people too hard, they're going to be radicalized in the opposite direction. So it's got to be a balance between opening up people's minds, saying, hey, look, I want you to step out of yourself for 1 second and just run through a bunch of different perspectives and then get back in your shoes and say, okay, now what do you think of this, right? Like now, if you had been in any of those other 10 subject positions, would your opinion have changed? Would you think about these things differently? And I think if we do that consistently over enough time, then people realize, wow, I didn't choose to be born where or the gender or the religion or any of these things. I didn't choose any of those things. I was born into that world. And if I had been born into the world in a different way, I would probably want different things. So again, that doesn't mean that you need to, in this chapter 1, we talk about the difference between empathy and sympathy a little bit, right? And it's like you don't
Hmm.
have to just go over and agree with everybody who you don't agree with, but you do kind of have to understand why it is that maybe they've come up with differing opinions, why they may think that they go down a different road, and it's not because they're evil or they're stupid or whatever. They may just be coming at this question from a different angle. And this is where ideally you've got a democratic system in which people vote and they go the direction that more people want. But again, a lot of this stuff is way harder than it seems. As we're just sort of making this, it's you just go about your life and you do these things. But at the end of the day, to circle back to sort of like the generalizations, we need to be making generalizations all the time just because there's so much information coming in. Our world is very complex. So we're going to be making those generalizations, but just always keeping a door or a dozen doors open to other alternatives, other possibilities, other people being wrong. And that would include, too, people being closed-minded. What do you do when you run into somebody who's terribly closed-minded, right? We run into people like that all the time. So these are questions that I don't think have great answers, definitive answers, but that idea that this process of world building and being able to cycle through lots of different perspectives, or how would the world have looked 100 years ago, or how might it look in 100 years, just keeping all of that alive in your brain and being willing to do that sort of mental role play, that mental, like, I wonder how I would feel if I were in that position, if I were the one who's being singled out for this thing. Do I feel like that is right or wrong? I think that's where you need to just kind of open up that possibility. And this is where it's like, oh, I'm always open to being wrong because I'm wrong all the time, right? But it's like, ideally, if you go through this process and you are empathetic towards other people and you are thinking critically, then your world model becomes more robust and more capable of being able to handle complicated challenges, where I believe the less that you're able to do that, then your worldview becomes brittle. And when your worldview becomes brittle and it breaks, then you become broken and you are more likely to act out in a violent way, or in a way that you would, not want somebody else to act out against you. So that idea, without sliding completely into moral relativism, having some flexibility in this and understanding that we don't all need to agree all of the time, I think would lead to a much healthier society.
Yeah, I keep thinking as you were talking about the notion of tuning somebody's perception. It comes out of the situated cognition
Hmm.
lineage of Ed Psych and various other philosophical and psychological histories. But the reason why I mention it is specifically because what we want learners to do is have their perception tuned to recognize things in the world around them as they're operating on a day-to-day basis. The goal is not to scold them one instance and then get them to change their perspective based on having been scolded. We want them to go into the world with this new lens available to them, to scan the environment and recognize when injustice appears, because telling somebody that injustice exists is different than them experiencing
Right.
or seeing for themselves that it exists. And I don't necessarily mean that literally, like witnessing something that's unjust. And certainly whether something is unjust is going to be in the eye of the beholder. So what we're trying to get them to do is understand that, going back to your example about going to a women's studies or a gender studies class and not necessarily having had the experience that would dictate that you'd see the world in that way, that it takes time for you to then be acquainted with the idea and eventually be able to go and see it out in the world. I know for myself, it was about probably my sophomore or junior year in college where I took a sociology class. And similar to you, it's not that I hadn't thought about some of these things before, but I didn't really have firm opinions because they weren't relevant to the life world I
Right.
was existing in
Yep.
at the time. So
Yep.
it's not that, or you could even frame it differently, where it's I just didn't know a lot of stuff because the town where I grew up, my graduating class was 82 people. I just didn't know enough about the world in order to be able to make sense of it at the time. So reading the seminal article that talks about unpacking privilege from the knapsack, the white knapsack, right? I was a white middle class person who grew up in a relatively rural area of New England. And it's like, what could I possibly have understood about the life of somebody growing up in urban Mississippi, right? Like
Right. Right.
my entire heritage, my entire culture, my entire family history, and the experiences that were generated through my life events up to that point were not oriented toward the same things that they would have been if I grew up in a very different part of the world at a very different time. And so
Exactly.
I don't think scolding younger me was going to be a successful way to get me to change my perspective, but giving me the opportunity to see those things for myself is what ultimately caused me to think more about them. And it's not to say that I was an unempathetic person before I read that specific article. It's just to say that there come these points where you can make a difference in that teachable moment to say to
Right.
somebody, hey, I know you think this, but have you considered this as an alternative?
Yeah.
And that can be enough to flip the switch for somebody to make that decision for themselves. Going back to that famous quote, you can't reason somebody out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. You
Right.
have to give them the opportunity to do that reasoning and make sense of the world based on their own life world, their
Yep.
own context, and then ultimately make that change. I know I had said earlier that this is sort of like getting the students to understand the world from a quantum perspective, but there are some really interesting applications of quantum theory you could make here to basically argue that things don't exist in the world for people until the moment they learn about them.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what the official date that a discovery happened was. If an individual person doesn't know about that thing, it's irrelevant because that never existed in the
Yeah.
world as they understand it. So really what we're trying to do is to get more students to see those things in the worlds that they inhabit so that they can make better decisions. They can think more pragmatically. They can behave in more pro-social ways, that they can empathize more effectively. And I know we keep saying, like, how are we going to measure these things? On an assessment level, we can talk more about that when we get to the assessment chapter, which is
Hmm.
chapter 5. But on a general level, I think the argument is people are going out into the world and being better people. And so
Yeah.
there are manifestations of that kind of behavior that are measurable. We can see it in
Yep.
how people treat others, in the way that they accept or reject others, the way that they talk about their comfort being out in the world with other people, or how many friends and family do you spend a lot of time with? How many people are you close to? There's been a lot of discussion recently about people not having enough close friends and that being a real societal issue. I think that's reflected in whether or not we're doing a good job teaching people to be critical thinkers and
Yeah.
empathetic. Is are they able to empathize with others enough to create space for them in their lives and be able to accept people for the flaws that they have or the discordant beliefs that they have? And this applies to you and me as much as it does to anybody else. We all believe things that are in conflict with one another. We all
Sure.
behave in ways that are in conflict with one another. And therefore, we need to be able to show one another enough grace to say, I could be wrong about this, or I do need more experience with this. I do need to be able to listen to other people and shut my own mouth for long enough to understand the world from their perspective. So
Right.
the question of critical thinking and empathy is really measurable on a micro scale in terms of how do I make a decision after going through a workshop, about ethical
Right.
behavior,
Right.
but it's also measurable and evaluative on the level of how am I changing my behavior as a person through life? How am I organizing myself as part of the community to which I belong? Am I actually making some sort of overt effort to understand other people in a way that I probably wouldn't have before coming across this specific method or this specific experience through some
Hmm.
experience I had in my class doing this kind of activity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's where too, well, because I'm sure throughout, this is something that we talk about all the time. I'm sure we will be hitting on this a lot, but just that idea that in ye olden days prior to the internet, if you had a niche thing that you were interested in or something that just was not something that was that popular, you could feel like you were the only person on the planet who liked that thing or felt that you were for it or whatever. Where now you go on the internet and it doesn't matter how niche it is, you will find a community of people, right? And this is
Hmm.
where it's really kind of dangerous, where it's like, I am going to filter out, like you ask 10,000 people and, 10,000 people and 9,999 will think that this is really weird and, disturbing or whatever. But I'm going to find 1,000 people online who agree with me, right? Like,
Hmm.
okay, that's self-selecting to a degree that is scary, right? I mean, it's one of those things where it's like you can hand pick what is sort of acceptable, what is whatever, as opposed to just being able to go out your front door and be like, oh, is this not a popular opinion? It's one of those things I'd read saying, a white supremacist who's living in North Carolina can now talk to a white supremacist who's living in Idaho, and he can share stories, right? And it's like, okay, that's not a great thing, right? Like we should not, that's the kind of communities, going back to what you said earlier, none of this stuff is like magic in which you just solves all the world's problems. Because if you self-select your group, then empathy doesn't really like, oh, am I going to find people who think exactly like me? Can I think about what it would be like to be in their shoes? That's not the goal, right? Like, of course,
Right.
it's like I love Andor. I think Andor was a great TV show. Can I put myself in the shoes of other Andor fans? Okay, well, yes. Well, we all love Andor, so it must be great, right? It's like, okay, that's not really what we're after here. You got to think about it
It's
much more broadly.
we should have a longer conversation about this when we get to the chapter on communities of practice because
Hmm.
it's deeply relevant in that
Yeah,
regard to
yeah,
how
yeah.
are people self-organizing, how are they self-selecting to be parts of these groups, what are the kinds of goals and standards that the groups set for themselves, how is leadership determined within those groups or centrality to those groups. I'm thinking specifically because this obviously cuts both ways. If you were growing up in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, all the way up until the invention of the internet, and you lived in a rural community, but
Yeah.
you were the only queer person you ever met or that existed, you didn't have the language to be able to talk about the way that you felt, and you didn't have a community that felt like you necessarily belonged in. Certainly some people did, but not everybody. And I would hazard a guess that not most queer people felt comfortable at the
Yeah.
time. And so the fact that the internet and digital technology has made it possible to find other people who belong to that same identity group or that same community is both incredibly empowering in those cases and can make a substantial positive difference in somebody's life, but it's also potentially destructive if you fall down the wrong community
Yeah,
rabbit holes.
absolutely.
And obviously, this is inflamed by the way that social media algorithms are designed and how they grab your attention. Chris Hayes's book, The Siren Call, is really, really great on that score. But one of the things that we have to kind of be mindful of as we're teaching students about this is that you don't want to, no matter what self-selecting technology or community you're a part of, you can't lose your ability to do this kind of empathizing with
Yeah.
other people,
Yeah, yeah.
because that is when you fall prey to all kinds of negative antisocial community groups, ways of thinking, actions, etc. So
All right, so we're over time here, which is common when we are talking about all of these things. But I think this is also to the point that these things don't exist discreetly amongst different sections of this book. It's all we're going to be talking about all these topics all throughout. So why don't we run through real quickly? We've got the book that's broken out into four sections, and we're going to talk about the overall sort of arc, narrative arc of the book. So Steve, section one's foundations. That's one that you primarily worked on.
yeah, section one or part one, foundations, is all about the educational principles that undergird the world building process. And I should stipulate too that a lot of the way that this book is written, at least the chronological order in which the chapters are organized, is basically the same as you and I, how we came to start doing this in our own classroom. So it was sort of coming up with the justification for why and how this could work in a classroom environment, followed by the practical application itself, followed by some reflection on that application. So for those of you who are reading from beginning to end straight through, you'll notice there is this sort of spine that holds the whole thing together, even though every chapter more or less integrates the same concepts and reorganizes them and synthesizes them in some different framework each time you reach a new set of ideas. The second chapter will be all about the history of educational psychology and philosophy, which then in chapter three gets applied to instructional design processes, how you could build a course around something like world building. And then chapters four and five, respectively, are about communities of practice and assessment, which is essentially how you would organize a group of students to do this kind of thing and how you're going to assess whether or not the process is working as intended. All of that is supposed to then feed into the next part of the book, the blueprint for doing world building, if you like, which, Trent, do you want to give a quick rundown of what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. Part two is the concepts, starting off with worlds and space and time, with scope and sequence, and basically saying where are you going to draw the boundaries for the physical extent of the world and where it exists on a timeline. And this is where, so we've got the structures and substructures as well that help describe the social forces. Going back to this conversation that we've been having, these are less solid and fixed definitions rather than just sort of the things that they're trying to capture in the moment. So the way that you use this language may change between different classes, different groups, all those kind of things. But basically, as long as the learners are on the same page as to what what the terminology means, that's really what this second section is going after, is saying, hey, look, we need to have some consensus on what these things mean. And then from there, let's talk about different ways in which they can be experienced, as long as we're using sort of the grammar that everybody will follow along with. So we go through the structures and the substructures of how we talk about societies, talking about demographics of different people who live in those worlds. And then we get through to the third section, which is world modeling, which is really just how do you do this in a classroom? How do you budget your time? What are the steps that you go through? What are the pitfalls? Because again, we've done this many times. And how do you do that throughout the course? Is this going to be an assignment, a unit, a semester-long project, a year-long project? All of those things are sort of accounted for in there. And then our final bit, Steve's case studies.
Yeah, the case studies are essentially a number of implementations that different educators at different levels have done. We're going to try and get some of those folks onto this podcast as a series of interviews to talk to them in more depth about what they did, how they thought about it. The general takeaway is that after undergoing the entire world building process with a class, there is an opportunity to refine for next time. So it's not a one and done that you develop this thing and then implement it and that's it. It is actually this recursive process where you are coming up with an idea, implementing that idea, and then finding ways to make it work more effectively for the next group of learners, which inherently looks different because of the open-ended nature of world building itself, that every group of students is going to yield some new set of information or new ideas that were not yielded by previous groups simply because of their areas of interest and their levels of expertise and what it is that they're bringing into the classroom with them, as opposed to just what they're learning from the resources that they're going through. So again, there's sort of this arc that follows along with the actual implementation, or at least the initiation of a world building project, and then the end of it where we come back and reflect on the process with the epilogue and then the case studies.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good place to leave it for now. This whole idea that process over product, the product still matters, but really that process and then that thinking about the process, how did you get there, is really sort of the best part of doing all this and what keeps us doing it semester to semester, year after year as well. Next time we will be going into chapter 2, and I guess we will leave it there.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right.
Thanks again.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
The World Building Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling Simulation and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.